recording.
Good evening. This is December 9th, 2024. The special meeting for our Property Sale Review Committee. I'm Juliet Parker, and I'm going to call the meeting to order at 5:38. Roll call, myself, Juliet Parker from the Town Council. I have David McBride as another council representative. Ms. Jackie Massett, RTM representative. Ms. Pentia Umritz from the EDC. Mr. Jonathan Reiner from, he's the Director of Office of Planning and Development Service, and Mr. John Burt, Town Manager. Absent is Susan Dean Schimbra, who is the RTM member representative.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
if I may,
Yes.
full disclosure, I sit on the board of Bill Memorial Library and I'm the secretary. However, I will not recuse because there is, in my opinion, there is no conflict of interest
Thank
for
you.
me.
Thank you. And I want to introduce Corinne Piazza to start our new business.
John, would you be able to pull up? Down one. Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm Corinne Piazza. I'm the Economic and Community Development Manager for Town of Groton. And my role tonight is I'm assisting with the administration of the PSRC. So helping the town manager's office, Juliet and the mayor with the process overall, and keeping everything on track. And for this presentation, I'll just walk you through 8 quick slides. This is to provide an overview of your role and responsibilities and the tools you'll have to use in this process so that you can become familiar with them and know what you're doing as the PSRC. If you could go to the next slide, please. Great. So to start, for the role, your PSRC role, basically we're zooming out and where it fits within the entire town property disposition process. There's a pretty extensive process back in July 2023 that the town council adopted. So this includes, essentially how to dispose of excess property. In September of 2024, town council approved the release of the Groton Heights RFP, and this is essentially the first excess property that will be subject to this process. In preparation for that, John's office and ours worked together to identify those administrative steps that are necessary to execute the new policy and create a schedule around that to support PSRC, and so that we can keep things moving ahead. Next slide, please. So overall, don't be overwhelmed by the text. You don't have to read that. Really, this is just a visual representation of our, essentially the town's disposition process. We broke it down into the phases, essentially the steps that are trying to be accomplished, so it's easier to digest. So the top row is really all you have to worry about. And you can see 2 big gold check marks, property review and identification of public benefits for the property. So
I'm sorry, going to pause for a moment so I can acknowledge Representative Dean Schimbra.
I apologize. I've been walking around 555.
I said, you're probably at the senior center.
5:41 p.m.
It's okay.
Thank you so much. All right, so the first 2 phases are done for Groton Heights, and you can see the "We Are Here" sticker. Essentially, this is the PSRC process and the steps that we're going to be going over tonight and where your role comes in. Next slide, please. So zooming into these 2 phases a little bit, you recognize that gold column, the "We Are Here" sticker. Essentially, we outlined the remaining process steps in the RFP, and they're laid out as you see here. So the PSRC process is essentially you're getting to a short list recommendation for town council. That's roughly 60 to 90 days. Then once you send that shortlist recommendation, it moves into the town council process to select that final concept developer. And that's another 60 to 90 days. And then finally, we get into negotiation and legal agreement process, and that's an additional 60 to 90. Next slide, please. So for your main tasks as the PSRC, essentially, we wanted to highlight those roles. And the first one, there's basically 4 steps. The first one is you'll be doing a preliminary scoring of the RFP responses. It's important to note those are not the final scores. That's just for you to dig in, get familiar with them, and initiate our first conversation about those responses. Step 2 is we'll have our next meeting. We'll discuss those preliminary scores and arrive at a selection of who you'd like to interview, and identify any clarifying questions you'd like to ask them about their response. And then we will move into interviews, and then we'll also eventually get into, after that, discussion and selection of a final shortlist that's a recommendation to town council. And essentially that last step we're working towards as a group. You select who you think should be in the shortlist through after your interview and review process, and recommend those folks to the town council. Next slide, please. So as part of the roles and responsibilities, we also have a disclosure that we're providing to all of you as just a reminder of the town's code of ethics and code of conduct. So essentially, the key takeaways for that, and you don't have to try to read that, I have a handout for you and a link to the code. But essentially, the key takeaways are the importance of confidentiality during the review and selection process. Everything's to be confidential to really protect the integrity of the process, the fairness of it for all the respondents, and then also so that you can deliberate without any interference. There's also an identification of potential conflict of interest. So it explains it further in the policy, but essentially what that means, if you were to make any financial gain by selecting a certain developer, you or a family member, that would be a conflict of interest, and it's clearly defined in the code. And the overall purpose, again, is to preserve the integrity of the process in allowing for that review window. And also, once you receive the RFP process, RFP responses, you'll be asked to just review the listing of officer sheet. We asked everyone to identify who's associated with their company, and you can verify if you feel you do or do not have a conflict of interest. Next slide, please. And we can dive into this a little bit more, but just as a sample of the preliminary scoring tool, it's very user-friendly, and it's laid out with scoring criteria and a weighted score. What we're scoring is outlined in the RFP, and it's reflected on the form. So it's a very clear connection between the two. And respondents are scored on a scale of 1 to 5, with total points possible for each section is 20, including the weighted score. So we'll dive into that a little bit once we're in our executive session, so I can show you how it works with some examples. Next slide, please. And the RFP was intentionally drafted to align all the responses that we received with the scoring criteria, so it's really easy for you to review. So highlighted in pink are the main sections that you'll be reviewing, and they include project approach, qualifications and experience, project viability and timeliness, and benefit to the town. And this really helps essentially because we may have different ideas coming in. It helps you compare what could be apples to oranges in a pretty consistent way, and really understand what their proposals are as they relate to the key priorities of the town. I highlighted town goals and preferred scope of development in there because you'll see everything should come back to that. This is where town council established what they wanted to see for the property. And we've asked respondents to basically make their case of how they're reaching those goals. Also, feasibility and timeline is really important, and any proposed incentives or deal structure that they have. And I put that on there because it's important to note, essentially, we're looking for a private partner to help us build what we'd like to see as our goals for this property. And there's going to be a lot of expense associated with that, especially if we're keeping the building, dealing with environmental remediation. And so we asked them to basically say how the town might be able to help offset some of those costs. So you'll see that in there as well. And it's important to note too, again, this is preliminary scoring. This is not, don't feel like your first round, you have to pick your absolute finalist. This is to help you get familiar with the responses, and then we'll move into discussion as a committee and move on from there. And then finally, you've all seen this schedule, but our next steps include tonight you'll receive access to the responses. We'll go in a little more detail over how to use the scoring sheet, and you'll get access to that as well. And then we can jump into just an overview of all those things, and you'll have until December 17th at noon to do your scoring and get those to me. And then we'll dive into our meeting number 2. We'll start that discussion of the preliminary scores and identifying our short list for interviews. And again, keeping in mind, you can also write down any clarifying questions you might have as you're reading those responses. And of course, we plan on the date staying the same, but it's subject to change just for schedules if needed. But no matter kind of what happens with the schedule, our purpose and outcomes will be the same for all of the meetings to get us to that final objective of the short list for town council. Next slide, please. And that is it. So we can jump into any questions you have. And at a high level, happy to answer them now, but if of course they're more detailed and something that might fall under an executive session, we'll just pin it for the next part of the meeting.
Go ahead.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
When we do the scoring, both the preliminary and the final, if we give someone a score of 5, do we have to rationalize why we do that? I simply
Sure.
that.
Yes, but it's not something you necessarily have to write out. You can keep that in your notes, and that's part of the discussion with the committee. You can bring up why you felt it was a 5, and share those thoughts. Someone may have thought it was a 3 or a 4, and eventually we'll get to a agreement of what the score should be.
Okay, that's 1. 2, if John or John have some insight into a particular developer, are they allowed to give us their insights? As it were, like developer A. Can we-
Right. As far as past performance.
Right,
Sure, I think that really anyone on the committee can do
Okay,
that.
all right.
And we'll focus mostly on the criteria and the scores and try to keep it to what we've asked them to provide as far as, so it stays, on track and objective. But yes, I think any information people have in general can be shared and the committee will decide.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Could you send out a copy of the presentation, everyone?
Definitely.
Thank you. Good evening, Counselor Merritt. We are actually get ready to go into executive session.
So I gotta get up and walk.
Yep.
Okay,
I'll give you the presentation we just had there. You can
Oh, yeah.
look at
that's what I'm interested in.
it.
Okay,
Okay, bring it on.
Right, so,
talk to you later.
all right, so our new business is the overview of the RFP respondents list, and this will be under executive session. Should I have somebody else?
Yes, so we should. either way.
Would you please motion?
Oh, absolutely. Motion for executive session, motion. I move that the members of the Groton Heights Property Sale Review Committee go into executive session pursuant to General Statute Section 1-2006D with the discussion of the selection of a site for the lease, sale, or purchase of real estate by the state or political subdivision of the state concerning potential purchase and development of the former Groton Heights Elementary property.
Second,
All in favor?
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions?
5:52.
5:52, we will be entering at 5:52 PM. Thank you.
Put your own slips in.
Do we need to put
And
the
then-
sign on it?
Yeah, just, I don't think I'm gonna show up, but just.
And then do we also, do we do anything different with the audio and video?
I think
No, I locked the webinar. Well, yeah, we'll pause it, but yeah. And while you're getting with that, I know. Oh.
We are returning back from executive session at 6:17. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? We are adjourned at 6:18.
Yes. Much more efficient.